Welcome to the podcast today. This is Revive. I'm your host, Michael Otano. Today we have a very interesting, I believe, a very needed subject that we're going to be talking to you today. But before I introduce that, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and make sure to share this podcast. This one's going to have eternal value. We're going to be talking about the rule book for a troubled child. There's a lot of people raising children today, and unfortunately, they're dealing with a troubled child. Troubled child would be one that maybe is resisting you as a parent. Maybe they've even fallen into rebellion. Whatever the case may be, I want to tell you there is hope and there is a rule manual. It's called the Word of God to help us deal with this type of situation. And you know, when a child is born, it's amazing because a child is born and immediately a hormone called oxytocin is being released. And when that child is placed in the arms of its mother and then the arms of its father, there is an eternal bond that takes place because of this oxytocin. It's also called the trust hormone. And so what happens, that child is placed into the lap of the mom, and then that child is placed into the arms of that father. And there is this trust that takes place. And it is a mutual trust that takes place. It's a trust where, first off, you have the mother and the father that have this sense that they are going to protect and they are going to provide for that child. And it is so deep and it is so internal that it is something that a parent will carry for them for a lifetime. And every parent knows exactly what I'm talking about. That day that your child was first born, you never forget about it. And the love that you have for your child. And that child in turn has this sense of trust where they trust their parent. They trust mom, they trust dad. A lot of times growing up, you see that they kind of incline to, sometimes they want to talk to mom more than dad or dad more than mom. But there is a bond that's there and they want to trust. But what happens if you're not careful, that there is a breach that begins to take place between the child and the parent. And this is a very dangerous and critical time because as a parent, you want to make sure that you are the greatest influence to your child. And you get that option when that child is born. And as you begin to rear that child and raise that child, you get to be that parent that influences your child. But what happens a lot of times, parents get caught up with work, they get caught up with responsibilities, they get caught up with life. And if you begin to neglect these critical years in your child's life, what begins to happen is you start diminishing the influence that you have over your child. And then you'll begin to notice that instead of having a relationship with your child, you now have resistance with your child. And it's very critical that when you see that resistance, that you step back in and you begin to build that relationship. It's never too late to build your relationship with your child. And as a parent, it's your number one responsibility is to build that relationship with that child. Nothing can get in the way of that. And this is one thing that's beautiful about marriage, because this conviction and this discipline in the hearts of the parent, they equally want to invest in that child because no one loves a child more than the parent. And what happens if they're resisting? It's time to get involved. It's time to begin to explore. It's time to ask those questions. It's time to begin to consider the things that are significant and important. What is your child interested in? It's time to learn a little bit about what they're interested in. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to overwhelm your child with a bunch of rules. You better listen to me. You've been resisting me, and it's just about rules, and it's about correction. Because what you're going to do, you're going to push your child away, and you're going to open the door of rebellion. And this is when that child becomes anti-rules, anti-authority, anti-parents. Then all of a sudden, you wake up one day, and you think, who is this child? and you become an enemy to your child. And while you may be listening to this podcast today, and while you think that that's a far off idea and that would never happen, it happens every day to parents. Parents are living with broken hearts. They're living with great despair because they don't know how to reach the child. But I have good news for you. There is a rule book. And in the rule book called the Bible, which are the basic instructions before leaving earth, the rule books, the Bible, tells us in the book of Proverbs, chapter number 11, verse number 21, one of my most favorite scriptures, it is that the seed of the righteous will be delivered. I want you to write that down. The seed of the righteous will be delivered. Why is that? Because that is a deposit, which is a promise. And a promise is a deposit from God of his intended future. That if you hold on to that promise and you refuse to let that light go, you'll understand that as you raise a child up, when they're older, they won't depart from that way. You hold on to that because you have to have a sense of peace and security that no matter what you're dealing with your child, that you're there and you're able to help them and you have hope for that child. The moment a parent falls into a hopeless situation, that's when they lose their sense and they deviate from the rule book, the Bible. And instead of taking a tender approach, they take a tough approach. And I promise you, in this day and age, we're living in the day and age where the Bible talks about in 2 Timothy chapter number 3, that perilous times are going to come. People are going to be lovers of their own selves. Children will be disobedient to parents and unthankful. That the culture will reflect this. And we're in the culture today that people are living for their own selves. They're just seeking after pleasure. They don't have any time for anything that they should have time for. Because you have to understand, life will stretch you, but whatever your priorities are, that's what you will do. And so what you have to do is you have that promise and you have to use tenderness and balance it with toughness. Because I'm not saying you don't enforce any rules to your child, but you have to understand that rules are balanced with relationships. And if you enforce rules to your child, but you don't give them relationship, the outcome will always be rebellion. But if you provide relationships with rules, you're going to be a happy parent and you're going to have a restored child. And so this is a process that you can take. And today I'm honored because I have a guest today that I'm going to be interviewing, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful man, and he's family to me. He's my assistant pastor, and he has been for about a year now, but for probably 20 years, he was my youth pastor. But before that, and his conversion in 2000, he came to the church and he was a troubled teenager. And he had a very difficult upbringing. His name is Michael Malkimos. And at this time, I'd like to welcome you today to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pastor. It's an honor to be here with you.
Well, have you tried the coffee yet?
Well, I'm about to. It's been calling my name. So
why don't you try the coffee real quick before we begin started in our interview?
Thank you, Lord, for this coffee. Wow, that is amazing.
I knew you were going to like it. I waited for the podcast just for you to taste it because we have a cafe in the church, of course, and we have some awesome coffee, and people are really enjoying that. But besides that, you've had a very difficult upbringing, a lot of challenges to your life.
Yeah.
And you don't look today like what you went through as a child.
Amen.
I want to begin to ask you, take us back to when you were a child. And when things seemed very difficult, how far back can you go when you remember that where you felt kind of just either defiant or broken because of life?
Yeah, well, I'll start from my birth because, brokenness typically begets brokenness. And at the age of 15, my mother left her home. Got together with my father, who never grew up with a father and without a mother. And my mom decided...
So your father wasn't in your life?
He was not. Well, he was in my life, and we'll get to that piece there. But
okay.
My mother met my father. she took off from the house at 15, fled to Puerto Rico with my dad, and thus I was born in Fajardo, Puerto Rico. From there, we stood there a little bit of time. I was an infant. And then, of course, my father and mother came back up this way. Unfortunately, my fondest memories of being a young child, somewhere between 3 and 5 years old, is my father domestically abusing my mother to the point where my mother lived caged almost like an animal.
Wow.
And so, I can still remember the fights, the screaming, and from there, my mom, one day my dad happened to go out, and she snuck out of the house literally to get away from him and broke that relationship. And of course, she took me with her. We went to my grandfather's and grandma's house, and I still remember to this day my father going over there, trying to break into the house, police coming, and the only thing that could calm my father was the police bringing me into the squad car with him to bring his tempers down. But those are some of my earliest memories. So you figure at that point,
there was a lot of dysfunction.
Yeah.
Wow. And then moving forward, so you recall that vividly. That was fused into your mind.
Yes.
And so that type of abuse, that type of environment that was very hostile began to affect you and take a toll, or even already as a child, as far as your emotional makeup, 3 to 5. And then let's go on to your adolescent years. You're 7 years old, you're 10 years old, up to maybe 15 years old. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, at that point, I didn't understand it. Of course, no longer being in the presence of my father affected me because I was trying to understand all of this. And it didn't just stop there, right? My father was extremely violent and, had some issues. And so that relationship, of course, affected me. I didn't understand it emotionally. I was sad, but I was also angry at the same time.
Right.
My father was a drug dealer pretty much all my life. And so
So he distributed narcotics.
He distributed narcotics and was, not to say this in some boastful way, but he was very successful at what he did. Let me just say that. Mm-hmm. So he always had all the goods, let's just say, that the world would look at as successful. Mm-hmm. But our relationship was broken from that point. I didn't understand why I was staying at my grandma's house with my mom. The issues with my father and mother continued every time he would come to pick me up. And then all I seen was trouble. Anytime my dad would pick me up, there was always issues. He would be selling drugs.
How old were you when you realized your father was distributing narcotics? How old were you?
Yeah, as early as, I would say, 8 years old, I started understanding it.
And so was that normalized to you that you okay, he sells drugs. It can't be bad, Daddy's selling drugs.
Yeah.
So there was a sense that was normalized.
Oh, yeah. It was very normal. My dad would take me on his ventures to distribute. I still remember the smell of marijuana and seeing bags and scales and all these different things, while he was putting things together, bringing people in and out of places, going to bars with me, putting me in side rooms or me waiting in the car. Wow. That was part of my upbringing. That's all I knew.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then you said you were very angry. Is this something that you think that was projected on you because you saw your father that was very angry and very hostile, that you kind of learned that behavior from him?
Yeah, I would say that definitely had an impact. But I think for me, the hardest part was the hurt. I dealt with a lot of hurt because, I always wanted to have a normal family. Mm-hmm. Seeing a father and a mother. Of course, when we moved in with my grandparents, you had a grandpa and a grandma there. So to me, that was normal. I didn't have that. Yeah. I didn't know why. And so I tried to figure it out in my head. And then between the age of 9 and 10, my father went to prison, and that really began to have more of an impact on me. My father wasn't your traditional type father, but he loved me. He was very affectionate, And whatever he can do to support me, provide for me, he would give my mother money, whatever. But he loved me as best as he could. But when that happened, it really impacted me a lot. And I can remember till this day the anger that I had inside of me going to school. Even my principal would take me into his office to have like counseling sessions because it was bleeding into my classrooms. I was getting in the fights, flunking, just had really disruptive relationships with people. And it was even in my grandparents' house where I started feeling a sense of rejection because I had a bad temper, but it was really trying to understand why.
You were hurting.
I was hurting. Yeah.
And you have what I would call a soul injury.
Yeah.
I want to define that for a moment here, because we can be in an environment that's dysfunctional. And what happens is that the dysfunction, our soul begins to bleed, and we begin to deal with the emotional pain. But when emotional pain is persistent, it turns into a trauma. And when it turns into a trauma, now we start acting out, and our soul is hemorrhaging. And we use violence, or we use a temperament, because we don't understand what's happening, because of now there's a soul injury that takes place. And this is why it's so important for parents to understand that if you're dealing with an angry child, a child that is hurting, you cannot threaten that child. You cannot use discipline on that child. You're going to have to reach that child with an unconditional love. And an unconditional love, it's a love that's unmerited. In other words, you did nothing to earn this love, and you're not going to do anything to lose this love. That's the love of Jesus. And every child needs that, because there is something about that type of love, that unconditional love, that when a child knows that it's love, it then can begin to heal from the pain that it's dealing with. Anytime there is conditional love, that will continue to infuse the pain in the child. Not only will it infuse the pain in the child, it will compound the pain in the child, because conditional love will promote rejection. And the more rejection that you feel, the more you lose your identity, and the more sorrow you're going to begin to deal with. And because of that, the more anger you're going to have. So let's talk about that. You were just living this out. Your father's now in prison, and I'm sure you're having to go over there and go see him and talk with him. And how did you feel about that? And it's interesting to me, because we're talking about this stuff that happened. You're in your 40s today. Yeah. We're talking about this, but you can recall this like if it was just yesterday.
Yeah, it's very vivid in my mind still. It was very difficult because, again, I'm trying to understand why this is happening. I'm trying to normalize it. And, of course, not having my father there impacted me. So then having to go see him in prison was very, very difficult. And my dad was always very affectionate and emotional, very, very tough. But yet when he would see me, there was always a deep love. And, it was hard walking in, seeing all these people in outfits and talking through a glass window with a little speaker there with my dad for a few minutes. I still remember this day, they would have little phone-like things there. And, mm-hmm. You would say these words, and the hardest part was always, sorry.
It's okay.
That departure, because, I didn't have my dad there with me. And so with that, you leave and you're still trying to answer questions. I mean, you're young, your mind's developing, you're not in a stable environment. And of course, at the same time, my mother is trying to figure herself out in a lot of these areas of what comes next. She began dating a certain individual from Chicago. It didn't work out, and then she met my stepfather, and so that was very difficult because I could never accept, even though my dad had all these injury or issues, somebody else replacing my father, and so I remember early on that I was very just against the relationship. and I would express that, wouldn't refrain. And
So were you very defiant at this point in time?
very defiant. Very
Even
defiant.
rebellious, you would say.
Yeah, extremely rebellious. And it came to a point where people just weren't sure how to control me. I could remember even at that age in school, them putting me in front of a therapist, and they were showing me all the different cards and pictures. What do you see here? They were trying to figure out what was going on with me. At that time, they didn't have medicines and all that they have now. But I was very hyper, very angry, and again, always getting into fights. But even at home, it was hard. And so it was hard for my mother. Eventually, she married my stepfather. And from the very beginning.
How old were you at this time when they got married?
I was 8 years old.
Okay. So moving then you went through the teenage years, and then you were very unruly, rebellious.
Yeah.
And then I know there was a time that you were in the juvenile system.
Yeah, so, I would say from 9 to 11, I really began to seek out identity and trying to find a family. At that time, we were living in East Chicago, and of course, gangs were a big thing. And so I made a lot of friends, and, I found refuge outside in the streets. And eventually, I seen myself pivoting in that direction because I wasn't finding affirmation at home. My mother was still trying to find herself, doing the best she could with what she had by marrying, my stepfather. He had a job, he provided, but yet, he had a lot of soul injuries himself. Yeah. And so you get an angry child with a person that had a lot of brokenness in their life. It was just a bad storm. And so the relationship was very toxic early on, but that propelled me to go outside and search meaning and identity. My father's in prison, of course. And then between the ages of 11 and 12 is when I finally decided to join a gang. That's when I said, I want to do this. I seen there was identity, there was a brand, there was meaning to it. And of course, there was acceptance. And that's what I wanted because nobody can control me. School couldn't, my family, my mom couldn't, my stepfather, and of course, my father's away. So I was kind of a lost cause, but yet still wanting to belong.
That is amazing. So at 11 years old, you're involved in gangs. And ultimately, you were part of what was called a Satan's disciple. Am I accurate on that?
Yeah. So I met some people, and of course, they were part of this big gang in Chicago called Satan Disciples. And I mean, it was amazing. At that time, we had a leader from the Chicago area that would come out to Indiana and recruit people. And I was always hanging out with people that were older than me. I always seen myself as a leader. I always aspired to be part of, something that was relevant. And of course, I had a lot of big bros, so to speak, that took me under their wing. This leader, that he would pick us up, take us to Chicago. We were going all over the place. I'm doing drugs. I'm sleeping all over. Don't know.
And how old are you? This is at even 11, 12, 13?
Yeah, 11, 12.
Unbelievable.
And so at that point, I'm not at home. I'm weeks away from home. Months. When I was 12, I was living in the streets for over a year.
Now we've got some viewers today, parents that are watching, and we're going to go on with your story because it's a happy ending. Your story is. The podcast today has blessed you and you see great value in it. I'd like for you to like and subscribe and make sure you share it with somebody. Help us revive someone else's life. Thank you.